All right, this is video 2 of the contract to buy and sell real estate residential. We're going to jump right into section 3, the dates and deadlines. So for dates and deadlines, I do have a couple of tricks and tips I want to share with you guys. So first and foremost, alternative earnest money deadline. There's a multitude of different ways you can fill this out. You can have a hard date, if you will. I'm more of a fan of something along the lines of 3 days. Oops, I'm sorry, 3 business days after MEC. So 3 business days after mutual execution of the contract. That's kind of a habit I've gotten into. I had a couple of different instances where I put a hard deadline in the contract, and turned out negotiations took several days, and then by the time we went under contract, my buyer was pretty well forced to have about a 4-hour window to submit earnest money. So I never want that to happen again. So I encourage you that if you're using hard dates, make sure that you're verbally communicating with the selling side and really feel positive about going under contract and allowing your buyer enough time to submit that earnest money. Moving right along to the title deadlines. So a little precursor, I skipped ahead a little bit. Dates and deadlines can be overwhelming and very eye-opening for any party, a seller or a buyer. And one of the things that I like to walk them through is that with each date and deadline, there is a corresponding clause or paragraph down below. So for alternative earnest money deadline, section 4.3, if we go straight to that, we should see earnest money. We'll get into filling this out here in a second, but one of the key pieces is if you fill out your dates and deadline correctly, then you should be able to explain to your client exactly what these mean while you're going through the dates and deadlines. And then when you're going through the contract, showing them exactly where the clauses are and showing them that that's what that date and deadline correlates to. Make sense? Great. So title deadlines, you're going to see both record title and off-record title. Record title deadline is going to be something that is recorded with the public records. Off-record would be something that is in process. Maybe the seller has not submitted their paperwork to the county for recording. Either way, what I like to tell people is if it's in the seller's possession and we put this date and deadline in there, and they fail to produce these documents to us, it is absolutely on them. Without having the dates and deadlines in there, there's nothing that commits them to providing those unrecorded documents to us. So for both record deadline and off-record deadline, I like to use the same date. Today is the April 10th, 2020. And so I like to, or title companies actually like to see us give them at least 5 to 7 business days. Being that, this is a hypothetical contract, let's say we went under contract this weekend sometime, I would choose somewhere along the lines of the 17th or maybe the 20th. And again, same for the off record. Now, once you get this title commitment or documents back, it can take your buyers a couple of different days to review that. Make sure you speak with them about how much time they're going to need with work schedules and life balances to be able to take a look at that. My general rule of thumb is about 2 days or over a weekend and possibly another business day in case there's any clarifying questions. So if I'm on a Friday, I'll put this one to the following Tuesday. And same thing with the off-record title objection deadlines. After that, if there is anything to object to and come together with, I'd like another couple of business days in between if we do need to do any sort of title resolution. First right of refusal deadline. We'll talk about this one here. This is not used that often. And first right of refusal can mean a couple of different things. It's interpreted a few different ways. So as far as a hypothetical situation, we're going to leave that be for now. Make sure you read section 8.6, understand what the first right of refusal deadline is, as well as there's some additional lingo behind that. That you can use. Seek your coach, seek your mentor if you are doing any sort of what we call a kickout clause. So a kickout clause and a first right of refusal deadline, you're going to hear those two terms. Make sure you ask, make sure you understand exactly what you're using and why you're using that deadline. Moving right along, owners association. So I wish this said homeowners association, so that way we all would know that this, is in balance with the HOA. But there's two deadlines here. There's one for the HOA documents to be delivered to the buyer from the seller or the HOA company, or possibly the title company. And then there's a deadline for buyer's review. And if there's something in the deadline or something in the documents that they do not like, they do have the right to terminate as long as you put this deadline in here. So HOAs can take anywhere from a week to 2 weeks. I like to go on the latter just in case it does take some time. So I might put something along the lines of the 23rd and then give them that full weekend to then review. Again, this is more of a negotiation standpoint. Some HOAs have the documents ready and available online. And if that's the case, you may see a listing agent who's pushing you to maybe put this into the first week of the contract. It's all dependent upon how you're going to receive those HOA documents. Seller's disclosures. So if you've never taken a listing before, I can assure you that when you do take a listing, you're going to need the seller to fill out some disclosures. A lot of these disclosures will be executed by the seller before the house gets listed, especially the seller's property disclosure and LeadBased Paint disclosure. So since these are already done, these should be able to be delivered to the buyer in a very reasonable amount of time. So I like to see about the first week. And here. So if you, seller's property disclosure is pretty much always a must. LeadBased Paint disclosure, remember 1978 or older is required. Again, if it's a 1978 home, make sure that you are having that conversation with your buyers. The last thing you want to do is have your buyers go out, take a look, and want to write an offer on a 1964 built home, and they have no idea about lead-based paint. You throw this disclosure in front of their face. It can be very scary for some people. Some people don't care. Some people have never had to deal with it, and so it's just an unknown. And when some people get to an unknown of an unknown, it can really freak some people out. So make sure you're educating your buyers, make sure they understand what a lead-based paint disclosure looks like. But again, for this purposes, this is just for a deadline for the seller to deliver to buyer. Moving right along, loan and credit application deadlines. Traditionally speaking, I've been doing this for 6 years now, and I have very, very rarely used date and deadlines 14 through 19. So we're going to focus on 12 and 13 here. New loan application deadline. I have seen this a few different ways. Some people will put in complete. For the purposes of this video, I honestly still use this myself, but technically speaking, your loan application with your buyer is not complete and is actually missing 2 items. So when you get a buyer pre-approved and you have a lender letter, it's actually not complete in the lender's system without a common address as well as a purchase price. So I have seen other people put out a deadline of, say, Monday if we're going over under contract over the weekend, and then that way that gives the lender some time to then see the contract, grab a purchase price, grab the address, and complete the loan application. As far as a new loan termination deadline, so when the buyer gets pre-approved, we go under contract, everything's happening, they're still living their life, and at the very end of the contract period, the lender is actually going to redo some checks with the buyer, employment verification, as well as a credit score recap, just to make sure the situation in the buyer's life has not changed. So I educate you and I encourage you to put this deadline as one of the closest deadlines to the actual closing day. Since we are in the world of the TRID lending laws, lending needs to pretty much be buttoned up about 3 days before we go to close. So I like this deadline about 3 to 4 days before your closing date. So if today is the 10th of April and we would look straight to the 30-day mark, we'd be looking at a Sunday, so possibly closing on that Monday, the 11th. I would like to see this loan termination deadline around I'd say the 6th or the 7th. Let's do the 6th to be safe. And appraisal deadline. So appraisals, depending upon what circumstances are happening in the world of lending and the economics. Currently, we are dealing with the COVID-19 virus, and that has made rates fluctuate drastically. And so there's a huge influx of refinances going on, which are causing appraisals to be slightly delayed with some lending institutions. So again, the point being, make sure you talk with your lender, ask them on a frequent basis how far out their appraisal processes have been being turned in, and apply your dates accordingly. So as far as the appraisal deadline, that's just the deadline for the appraiser to actually go out to the house and perform their duties. So again, 2 to 3 weeks, let's just call it the 24th here, and then an objection deadline. So the objection deadline would be the appraisal goes out to the property, hits their deadline, and then has an appraisal report done in order for the buyer to review and see if there's anything to object to. On an appraisal, obviously, the objection would be if there is an appraisal deficit. If there is an appraisal overage or an appraisal that comes in right at value, congratulations, you move right on with the contract. The seller does not need to know if the appraised value comes in over where your purchase price is. Buyer does not have to purchase the home at the higher appraised value, just simply the purchase price in the contract. If you have any questions on that, I am Bruce Carley. Give me a call. So if we have that deadline there, we shall have our objection deadline around the 27th. And if we do need to resolve any issues, I like to push the buyer and seller into talking and negotiating between maybe a 1 to 2 day mark. So we'll click the 29th for the purposes of this video. Moving on to the survey, or I should say an ILC or survey deadlines. This is traditionally filled out for more of an acreage property. I do educate my buyers that if they are buying a lot and block property in town, they still have the right to do this. Most people will elect not to, as ILCs and surveys can cost anywhere from $800 up to a couple of $1,000s. Make sure that you educate your buyer. Make sure that if they want these deadlines in there, that they know exactly what they're doing and how that process will work. So if they do need to order something, surveys take a little longer than an inspection or an appraisal. So they're closer to, I would say, more on the 2 to 3 week mark, but more likely 3 to maybe 3.5, 4 weeks. So if we are doing an ILC or survey, let's put this guy out until around the 1st or maybe the 4th of May. Again, a couple of days to review something that a buyer doesn't formally or used to seeing. They probably need a few days for that. So we'd be looking at maybe the 6th. And then if there's anything, any sort of boundary discrepancy that we need to resolve, we put our resolution date again a few days after. If there's any sort of discrepancy, we'd probably be talking to some surveyors. So give some business days in here, depending upon when your weekdays or when your deadlines are falling. Inspection and due diligence. So inspection deadlines. You're going to see that in any given market and any given thought behind how a selling agent or seller operates. Traditionally speaking, we'd be looking at anywhere between a week and a half to 2 weeks for an inspection objection deadline. You will see some sellers challenge some buyer parties to get that done within the first 3 to 4 days. Again, any date and deadline in here that you're not necessarily in full control of, make sure you're talking to your inspectors, make sure you know how far out their lead times are, and simply have that conversation with the selling side. So for our purposes, an inspection objection would probably look around the line, somewhere along the lines of the 21st. And I like my termination and resolution deadline on the same day, again, allowing a few business days to review and to negotiate. So a couple of days there. Property insurance termination deadline. Rule of thumb for me is pop this date as the same date as the inspection objection. The reason being is once you go under contract with a buyer, the buyer's kind of pent up. They're going to get their earnest money ready. They're excited. They're scheduling their inspection. And then once the earnest money is submitted, their inspection scheduled, there's a limbo period. They're just waiting to see what that inspection report looks like. Having the property insurance termination deadline around that same objection deadline for inspection allows them to work on something else and kind of take that nervous energy out of the air and continue on with the loan process because the lender will need a property insurance quote. Due diligence documents. So due diligence documents are anything that pertains to the home that the seller would have in their possession. Again, a great listing agent will educate their sellers on having those documents ready for when they do go under contract. So these documents should be ready and available. So I like to see these before the inspection because there are certain times where you have due diligence documents that will correlate with the inspection. For instance, if there was a house fire in the kitchen and the kitchen was remodeled, you're going to want to see all that documentation so that way your inspector can take a look at that while they inspect the home and understand why there's a new kitchen in that home and was it properly redone and mitigated from the fire. So due diligence documents delivery would be somewhere around the first week. So if we have our inspection objection deadline on the 21st, maybe we should deliver this around the 15th. Object before the weekend, and if there's any resolution, let's put that around the same deadline as your inspection objection. Conditional sale deadline. This deadline is the deadline for a buyer who needs to sell their current home in order to purchase the property that you're writing a contract for. So with a conditional sale deadline, this deadline is for the closing, the successful sale and close of their conditional property. There's a few different takes on it out there. I've seen people use this deadline more for a under contract deadline for the buying side to put their conditional sale under contract by. It is for the successful close. So again, if we were talking up here about our loan termination deadline being on May 6th, so that would take our closing 3 to 4 days after that. We would like to close possibly on the same day as the conditional sale, unless otherwise agreed upon with both buyer and seller on both sides. 6, so we'll close on both properties, let's say the 12th, let's give us a Monday. And there's a date we skipped here, LeadBased Paint termination deadline. So again, educating your buyers, you might not ever have to use or exercise the use of this this termination deadline. But what I do like to see is this deadline be somewhere along the lines of a couple of days after the LeadBased Paint disclosure delivery deadline. So, now, talking about your closing date, and possession time. If you're closing and taking possession on the same day, then I like to use the language of possession time upon delivery of deed. Since we don't know exactly the time and hour, or I should say time and place, that we'll be closing at this point, I just like to put it as whenever the deed is delivered to the buyer, they have possession. Unless it is otherwise negotiated. So sometimes a seller will want to close maybe on the 12th, and then maybe they want a few days just to make sure that they're out of the home, and maybe they have a moving company set up or are closing on another home. And there's a post-occupancy agreement, or what we call a PCOA, that's going into effect. So then you would click on maybe the 15th, and over here, then you would have a set time of day that both parties would need to agree upon. The acceptance deadline, my favorite deadline in here. This acceptance deadline is key and very important to understand. I think that there's a lot of us agents that use this acceptance deadline as a response deadline. I'm here to tell you it's not a response deadline. An acceptance deadline is just that. If the seller wants to accept this buyer's contract as is, they would need to accept it on or before a date set forth and a time set forth in order to fully be able to execute this contract. If the sellers take longer than 8 p.m. on the 11th to decide whether they want to take this offer or not, and they decide to take it after the fact, it's up to the buyer then to decide whether they want to continue on since the seller missed the acceptance deadline. If the seller likes this offer, goes past the acceptance deadline, and is going to counter the offer, there's really no deadline for them to hit because they don't have any real time constraints on how long they need to take to counter this contract. Traditionally, what we see is around 24 hours. But again, I've seen all sorts of different things come up. So if you have any questions on when a seller should respond, the acceptance deadline, and things of that nature, reach out to your mentor or coach. Happy to help. Before we move along, there's a note here. I think that gets frequently missed. If you have an FHA or VA loan, or VA buyer, I should say, please note here, VA and FHA loans or appraisal deadlines do not apply with these dates and deadlines. So you always will need to keep those dates and deadlines in there. It's not that you don't need to put them in. You do need to give these appraisers a target and some sort of timeline to hit. But if they are 1 or 2 days late on delivering or doing some things for you, they do not apply, which means you do not have to amend the contract and panic. Take it as you get it. Talk to your lender and be very communicative. Section 4, talking about purchase price and terms. So purchase price, obviously, whatever you and your buyer decide they want to go in on. Here's where you put the earnest money amount. Traditionally speaking, earnest money is advertised in the MLS. Depending upon what MLS system you're using, it could be at the bottom of the page, the top of the page, right in the middle. Make sure you understand and know where the earnest money amount is being advertised. However, earnest money is negotiable. So if the buyer wants to submit more earnest money to show good faith in their offer, they can do so. If they don't have the money or don't want to spend the money right away, they can actually type in an earnest money amount that's a little lower than what's advertised on the MLS. So for the example purposes, let's type in $100,000 property. Earnest money, again, if it's about 1% of the purchase price, let's do $1,000. And if the buyer is bringing, let's say, 5% down payment if the buyer's putting together a 5% down payment to the loan, then your new loan amount would be $95,000. And you can see my cash at closing then turns into $4,000. So $4,000 is not all of the $5,000. Keep in mind they have earnest money submitted, so the 1 plus 4 equals 5%. Section 4.2, seller concession. This is the area where if your seller or if your buyer needs additional funds from the seller in order to maybe complete their loan or help with closing costs, seller concession is used basically as a seller crediting the buyer a certain amount of money to help pay for closing costs and prepaids. If you need to use that, this is where you would put that dollar amount. Make sure, a rule of thumb is your seller concession cannot exceed what the lender can use for closing costs and prepaids. And what I mean by that is if you want the seller to commit to $10,000 of seller concession, I can pretty well tell you that the lender will not need to use all of that. So if you execute this contract, the seller agrees to $10,000, but the lender comes back and says, I can only use $6,000 of the $10,000, the buyer just doesn't receive a $4,000 check. That actually is just wiped off the table. There's no agreement to do a price reduction. So make sure that if you're asking for seller concession, you're aware of how much the lender can actually use. Earnest money. So this earnest money will be set forth in the section in the form of a blank. I've seen a multitude of different ways you can describe this. Good funds is a very popular one. I personally myself like to use the wording check or wire. Oops. And then held by XYZ title company, whoever title company you're using, again, that's going to be in the MLS. Traditionally speaking, it's around the earnest money amount. So again, sellers typically use or choose the title company. So make sure you're looking at that. If your buyers want to choose the title company, we'll talk about that in one of the next videos here. Moving right along, section 4.5, new loan. So very common for us to use section 4.5, and the rest of section 4 traditionally is blank, but we'll go over it briefly here. If you have a traditional buyer who is using a loan, this is where you would select their loan type. You will notice that you can select different loan types here. And not just one at a time. And the reason for that is, let's say you have a VA buyer who actually has a down payment. They may or may not choose to go with their VA loan. And so if they're approved for a VA loan, they might be approved for a conventional loan as well. This would give the buyer the option to choose during the contract without having to do an amendment to the contract, depending upon what loan they end up deciding upon. Section 4.6, this is for a loan assumption. This would be if a buyer is purchasing a home and assuming the seller's current loan. If you have any questions on that, reach out. And similar situation to a seller of private financing. So seller of private financing would be where a buyer isn't necessarily assuming the seller's current loan. They're actually using the seller as a lender. So they are using the seller or seller's private financing, paying interest and all of that. You will need a separate addendum that attaches to the contract if you're doing something like this, which specifies the terms and conditions. Again, not to go into it in too much detail, but reach out if you ever have that situation. Section 5, this is actually what this section actually correlates to some of the dates and deadlines above. This is where the buyer has the right to terminate the loan as detailed under section 25.1. So you're going to see section 25.1 referenced quite a few times in this contract. That is the clause for someone to terminate based upon that particular clause in the contract. Buyer's credit information or existing loan review. Again, this would be more for a special circumstance or situation. If you're getting into any sort of these situations, reach out, make sure this contract is filled out right, and make sure you understand exactly what these clauses mean. Section